The bird should not have looked at her. That was the thought that crossed Mara's mind in the half-second before everything in her life changed. Before the world she had carefully built around her own invisibility collapsed like wet ash beneath an open flame. The bird should not have looked at her. And yet it did. Sorin, the sacred falcon of King Kalin of Valethorn, the creature of smoke and ember feathers that had not obeyed any hand but the king's in 11 years of royal service, turned his ancient golden eyes away from the outstretched punishing arm of his sovereign and fixed them on her. On Mara. On the girl in the brown servant's tunic standing 30 feet back from the ceremony circle, half hidden behind the carved pillar where she had pressed herself to avoid being noticed. The entire court went silent. Not the polite silence of ceremony. The stunned, airless silence of something impossible happening in plain sight. She did not breathe. She was not sure she could. The great hunting ceremony was the most sacred ritual in the Valethorn calendar, the moment each year when the king demonstrated his bond with the royal falcon in front of every lord, lady, general, and foreign dignitary the kingdom could assemble. It was proof of legitimate rule. It was proof of bloodline. It was proof that the gods themselves recognized Kalin Valethorn as the rightful king, because Sorin, descended from the first falcon of the founding myths, only ever bonded with those whose souls the ancient power approved of. And now, Sorin was ignoring the king's arm. He sat motionless on the ceremonial perch, his ember feathers catching the morning light like banked coals, and he was staring at Mara with the focused, unblinking attention of a creature who had made a decision and found it entirely unremarkable. Sorin. The king's voice was low and controlled, the voice of a man who had learned very young that a ruler must never let his face betray his interior. But Mara had been cleaning the Falcon Muse for 3 years. She knew Sorin's sounds and Sorin's silences and Sorin's moods better than anyone in this court would ever guess. And she also knew, because she was standing close enough and the morning was quiet enough, that King Kalin Valethorn had just exhaled very slowly through his nose, which meant he was not as controlled as he appeared. "Come," he said. The command was not loud. It did not need to be. Every person present heard it in the silence. And Sorin turned his head away from the king entirely and looked only at Mara. She wanted to disappear. She had spent the better part of 23 years perfecting the art of disappearing, of making herself small and brown and uninteresting, of moving through rooms without leaving footprints, of completing her work before anyone arrived and vanishing before anyone could look her direction. She was Mara of no house, Mara, daughter of Edric the disgraced falconer, Mara who had no wolf and no power and no future. Beyond the service, she performed quietly enough that people forgot she was there. She was not supposed to be seen. She was certainly not supposed to be seen by a sacred falcon, while 300 members of the Valethorn court watched. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Lord Cassian, the king's chief advisor, stepped forward from his position at the ceremony's edge. He was a tall man with a scholar's stoop and a politician's eyes, and those eyes were moving between Sorin and Mara with an expression she could not entirely read. "Your Majesty," he said very quietly. The king did not respond. He was still looking at the falcon. Sorin was still looking at Mara. And then, with the unhurried certainty of a creature that had never once in its life done anything it did not intend to do, Sorin spread his wings, lifted from the perch in a single powerful sweep of ember-colored feathers, crossed the 30 feet of ceremonial space, and landed on Mara's left shoulder. The impact was substantial. His talons gripped through the cloth of her tunic, careful, deliberate, not breaking skin, but unmistakably present. His weight was warm and alive and enormous. His feathers brushed her cheek, and he settled, as if he had always been there, as if this was exactly where he had always meant to be. The silence lasted 3 more seconds. Then it broke into sound all at once, a wave of voices. Crashing over the ceremony ground, lords and ladies turning to one another with expressions ranging from shock to offense, to something that looked, on the oldest faces, uncomfortably like recognition. Mara stood very still. She understood, in the way that people understand catastrophic things, that her life had just changed irrevocably in a public forum in front of witnesses she could not unwitness, and that there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. She looked straight ahead. She did not look at the king. She was afraid of what she might see if she did. She heard Lady Vivian before she saw her. Vivian of House Selene had a voice like poured silver, beautiful and cold, and capable of cutting without appearing to try. She was the woman the king was expected to formally claim at the winter solstice ceremony, the alliance that would end the 3-decade tension between Velthorn and the Selene territories, the political solution to a problem that had outlasted 2 previous kings. She was also, by any measure Mara had ever applied, the most deliberately perfect person she had ever observed from a careful distance. "How extraordinary," Vivian said. The 2 words carried across the ceremony ground as clearly as a bell. The falconer's disgraced daughter. She paused. The gods do have a sense of humor. The laughter that followed was not kind. Mara felt it land on her skin like small thrown stones, each one individually too small to be worth acknowledging, collectively enough to make a person want to fold inward. She did not fold. She could not, because Soren's talons were steady on her shoulder, and his weight was grounding in a way she could not explain, in a way that made it easier to keep her spine straight and her chin level and her eyes forward, focused on the middle distance where she was not looking at anyone, and anyone having difficulty looking directly at her would find nothing to aim their cruelty at. She had learned this. She had been learning it since she was 8 years old, and the court had watched her father led away in chains, and someone had thrown a rotten pear at her in the market square. You could not stop people from looking. You could control what they found when they did. "Remove the bird," someone said. She thought it was Lord Fenwick, one of the older lords who had despised her father for reasons that had never been fully explained to her, and had transferred that antipathy to her with the uncomplicated efficiency of a man who did not examine his prejudices. "Someone remove it from the servant girl before this spectacle goes any further." There was a murmur of agreement, and then silence again. A different kind of silence this time, the kind that preceded a king speaking. "No one," King Calen Velthorn said, and his voice was still controlled, still even, still the voice of a man who had mastered the art of revealing nothing. "Will touch the falcon." He paused. "Or the girl." Mara looked at him then. She had been avoiding it, but the words pulled her gaze before she could stop it. And for the first time in the 3 years she had spent in proximity to the Velthorn court, without ever exchanging a direct word with its ruler, she looked at King Calen Velthorn at close range and in full light. He was looking back at her. She had expected irritation. She had expected the cold calculation of a man assessing a political inconvenience. She had not expected the expression she actually found on his face, which was not quite any of those things, which was in fact something she could not name. Something complicated and restrained, and held very carefully in check, in the way that things are held in check when they are large, and a person is not yet sure what to do with them. He was not young, exactly. He was perhaps 30, with the particular quality of a man who had been carrying substantial weight for long enough that it no longer showed on him as strain, but simply as density, a heaviness of bearing that was not unhappiness, but was not ease either. His eyes were dark gray and they were very direct, and they did not look away from her when she looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than she expected. Then he looked at Soren, still steady and immovable on her shoulder. Something moved across his face. She could not name that either. "The ceremony is concluded," Lord Cassian said, stepping smoothly into the space where a king's next words should have been. He was very good at that, Mara had heard, at managing the space around Calen, so that difficult moments became transitions. "We will reconvene in the Great Hall at midday for the formal proceedings." He was already moving toward the crowd, already redirecting attention with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades herding powerful people in the directions they needed to go. The crowd began to disperse, slowly, in clusters of murmured conversation that Mara did not want to imagine. Vivian moved away without looking at her again, which was somehow worse than being looked at. Lord Fenwick muttered something to the man beside him, and also left. One by one, and then in groups, the court dissolved from the ceremony ground, and Mara stood still under the weight of the falcon on her shoulder, and waited to understand what was happening to her. The king had not moved. She realized this when the crowd thinned enough for her to see that he was still standing in the ceremony circle, still watching her, still wearing that expression she could not read. Only Lord Cassian remained near him, and the advisor was speaking in a low voice with the posture of someone delivering unwelcome information with as much grace as possible. Kaelin listened without apparent reaction. His eyes stayed on Mara. She felt suddenly and acutely aware of how she looked. The brown tunic with the fraying hem, the hair she had braided back for practicality rather than appearance, the hands rough from cleaning, and feeding and maintaining the muse through 3 winters. She was aware of how little she resembled anything a king ought to be looking at. She was aware that Soren's warmth against her neck and shoulder was the most comfortable she had felt in recent memory, which was a disturbing thing to be aware of while a king was watching her from a ceremony circle. "You may bring him to the muse," Kaelin said. He had crossed the distance between them while she was cataloging her own inadequacies, and he was closer than she had realized, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. His voice at this proximity was different than it was across a crowd. Still controlled, still even. But there was something underneath the evenness now. Something that vibrated at a frequency she felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. "He will not come to me today. I can see that." He studied Soren for a moment. The falcon clicked his beak once, a sound Mara had learned to interpret as a kind of greeting, and turned his head to look at the king with what appeared to be mild interest. Kaelin's jaw tightened slightly. "He has never done this," he said, and she was not sure he was speaking to her or simply speaking. "I know," she said. Then she pressed her lips together, because she had not intended to speak, and saying that she knew implied a familiarity with his falcon that a servant in the stables was not supposed to possess. He looked at her. "How do you know?" he asked. His tone was not accusatory. It was genuinely curious, and somehow that was more unsettling. She considered lying. She was quite good at lying in the way that people who spend most of their lives trying not to be noticed become good at it, saying nothing remarkable, nothing memorable, passing through conversations like water through a hand. But Soren chose that moment to turn his head and press his beak very gently against her cheekbone, a gesture she recognized as the falcon equivalent of an eye, affectionate acknowledgement. The same gesture he had been making when she brought him his morning food for 2.5 years without telling anyone. She felt the king see it. She felt the precise moment he understood that the bird and the servant girl had a history he had not known about. "I take care of him in the mornings," she said, "before the head falconer arrives, before anyone else is in the mews." She paused. "He has never done this with anyone. In 3 years of watching him, he has never chosen anyone but you." The king was quiet for a moment. "And yet today he chose you," he said, in front of everyone. She did not know what to say to that. She did not think there was anything she could say. "Come to my study this evening," he said. "After the midday proceedings. I will have Cassian send for you." He paused. "You are safe in the meantime. I have said so publicly. No one in this court will touch you." He said the last words with a flatness that made it clear they were not reassurance, but information. He turned and walked back toward the palace, and Lord Cassian fell into step beside him, and Mara stood on the empty ceremony ground with the sacred falcon warm on her shoulder, and the morning light already shifting toward midday, and she thought, very clearly and with great precision, that her father had always said the worst trouble was the kind that came wearing the face of something good. The mews were in the east wing of the palace grounds, a long stone building that smelled of feathers and clean hay and the particular mineral sharpness of birds of prey. a smell that Mara associated with the only hours of her days that she would have described as genuinely hers. She had begun coming before dawn, long before her official duties required her, initially because she could not sleep and the mews were quiet, and there was something about the quality of silence around birds, alert and watchful rather than empty, that she found easier than the silence of her small room where her thoughts were too loud. She had not meant to become Soren's keeper in any unofficial sense. She had simply been there, and Soren had noticed. And over the course of many mornings she had learned his sounds and his moods, and the precise way he liked his feathers, smoothed after his bath. And he had allowed her closer and closer, until the distance between them was nothing at all, until he leaned into her hand with the complete trust of a creature who had assessed her thoroughly, and found her not wanting. She settled him back on his perch now, and he stepped from her shoulder with the dignified reluctance of someone acceding to a reasonable request they do not fully agree with. She checked his feathers carefully. A habit. His ember coloring was extraordinary up close, not a single flat color but many, deepening from pale gold at the tips to a dark burning rust at the base, and in certain lights shifting to something almost copper, almost red, almost the color of a particular kind of fire. The old stories called him descended from the first flame, which Mara had always assumed was metaphor. She was no longer entirely sure. She fed him from the preparation she had already laid out that morning, watched him eat with the brisk efficiency of a healthy predator, and tried to think clearly about what had happened, and what it meant, and what she was going to do about it. She did not get far in this thinking before the door to the mews opened, and someone who was not a falconer or a stableman came through it. Vivienne of House Solène was even more precisely beautiful at close range than she was from a distance. She wore pale green that set off her dark hair and the cool marble quality of her complexion, and she moved through the doorway of the working mews with the practiced ease of a woman who made every space she entered feel like it had been arranged for her arrival. She looked at Mara for a moment, with an expression that managed to be simultaneously assessing and dismissive, a considerable social feat. Then she looked at Soren on his perch, who looked back at her with the particular quality of stillness that Mara had come to recognize as the falcon's version of indifference. "He will not choose me," Vivienne said. She did not say it with any particular emotion. It was an observation. "I have tried. 3 times since my betrothal was formalized. I thought, given what the bond is supposed to mean for a future queen, that it was something I should attempt." She paused. "He looked through me as if I were glass." She turned her gaze from the falcon back to Mara. "And then he chooses you, a falconer's daughter, in public, during the great ceremony." She tilted her head slightly. "What exactly do you think is happening?" Mara kept her hand steady on the edge of the feeding tray. "I do not know," she said. "I imagine that is what everyone is trying to determine." Vivienne smiled. It was a precise smile, not unkind in an obvious way, but constructed rather than felt. The smile of someone who understood its effect. "You are more composed than I expected," she said, "given your circumstances." She let that sit for a moment before continuing. "I want you to understand something, Mara. I am not your enemy. I am going to be the queen of this kingdom. And the falcon's behavior today is an inconvenience, but it is one that can be managed. Kaelin is a practical man. He understands what this alliance means, and he will not allow the superstitions attached to a bird, however ancient, to derail the political reality of what we are building." She paused again. "But you could make things considerably simpler by being discreet, by not encouraging whatever this is, by remembering what you are and what I am, and allowing the natural order of things to proceed. And if Soren makes the same choice again," Mara said, and she was not sure where the words came from. They arrived in her mouth before she had decided to speak them. "The next time the king calls him?" Vivienne's smile did not change exactly, but something behind it did. "Then we will cross that difficulty when we reach it," she said. She looked at Soren one more time. The falcon clicked his beak at her, the sound Mara had catalogued as dismissal. Vivienne turned and walked back through the door with the same composed ease with which she had arrived. and Mara let out a breath she had not known she was holding, and gripped the edge of the feeding tray until the wood bit into her palms, and she felt steady again. She had been 7 years old when her father came home with a falcon on his arm for the first time. Not Soren, a smaller bird, a working hunter named Ash, and had shown her how to hold her arm and keep her gaze steady, and let the bird come to her, rather than reaching for it. Patience, he had said, and stillness. A bird of prey will tell you everything about yourself. They can smell fear, and they can smell falseness, and they will not come to either. If a falcon chooses your arm, it is not because you tricked it. It is because it looked at you and found nothing to be afraid of. Her father had been wrong about many things. She was still not entirely sure he had been wrong about that. The king's study was on the 4th floor of the central tower, a room she had never been in and had never expected to be in, with windows that looked east over the hunting grounds, and shelves of books and maps that gave the impression of a mind that operated in multiple registers simultaneously. Lord Cassian met her at the door and led her in with the neutral courtesy of a man who had suspended his personal assessments for the evening in favor of professional function, which she appreciated more than she could express. Kaelin was standing at the eastern window when she entered, looking out at the hunting grounds where the last of the day's light was doing something complicated to the tree line. He turned when she came in. He had changed from his ceremony clothes into something simpler, dark fabric without ornamentation, and this made him look less like a ceremonial figure and more like a person, which she was not sure was easier to deal with. "Sit," he said, and gestured to a chair near the table. She sat. He remained standing, which felt deliberate, and she understood that he was working out how to begin something he had not expected to be working out today. She waited. She was good at waiting. "Tell me what you know about your father," he said. She had not expected that. "I know what everyone knows," she said carefully. "That he was the royal falconer for 12 years. That he was accused of selling information about the king's hunting routes to a foreign party. That he was convicted and stripped of his position and imprisoned." She paused. "That he died in prison 4 years ago." Kaelin looked at her. "Is that what you believe happened?" he asked. She kept her hands in her lap and her face still. "I believe it is what the court decided happened," she said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. He moved from the window and sat across from her at the table, which changed the geometry of the conversation in a way she found slightly easier to manage. "Your father was not selling information to a foreign party," he said. She felt the words land somewhere in her chest like a key, turning in a lock she had not known was there. He was investigating the source of a very old document that had come to him through Soren. He paused. "Through the Falcon, which is not a thing that should be possible for the record. Falcons do not carry documents to people who are not their bonded handlers. And yet Soren brought your father a scroll, ancient, written in a script your father spent the last year of his service trying to identify. He did not tell me because he was not sure what it meant yet. And someone else discovered what he was doing before he could reach the answer." She was very still. "What script?" she said. Not a question. More like a thing she was not sure she wanted to confirm. Kaelin reached into the table's single drawer and placed a small object in front of her. It was a piece of old leather, marked with signs she had seen before, traced into the wooden frame of her father's old work chest that she still had, that she had assumed was decorative. She had been looking at those marks her entire life. "That one," he said. "What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." She reached out and touched the leather piece without picking it up. The marks were precise and deliberate, not ornamental at all when you looked closely. Each sign placed in relationship to the others in a way that implied structure, language, meaning. "What does it say?" she said. Kaelin leaned back slightly in his chair. "We have had 3 scholars attempt a translation in the past week," he said. "Since I found this in Cassian's files while revisiting your father's case." She looked up at that. Revisiting. He had been revisiting her father's case. He saw her register this, and did not offer explanation, simply continued. The best reading we have, across all 3 translations, is something approximately like, "The blood remembers what the name forgot." The line does not end. It waits. He was watching her carefully. She was aware of this, and was finding it harder than usual to maintain the quality of blankness she normally kept over her face in. Difficult moments. "My father was looking for what that meant," she said. "And someone stopped him before he found it." Kaelin said, "Yes." She said, "And now Soren has done to me what he did to my father." A pause. "With the considerable difference that he did it in front of 300 people. A longer pause. "Yes," Kaelin said again. She looked at the leather piece for a long moment. Then she looked at the king. "What do you want from me?" she said. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. She genuinely did not know, and she had found over the years that not knowing and admitting it was considerably more efficient than pretending to know and proceeding incorrectly. He seemed to consider the question seriously, which she respected. "Answers," he said. "Soren chose you the way the old stories say the first Falcon chose the first king. That has not happened in recorded history with anyone outside the royal bloodline. It should not be possible for you. And yet..." He paused. "I want to understand why. I think you may be the only person who can help me find out. And I think your father's death, and whatever he discovered, are the beginning of that answer, rather than the end of it." She sat with this for a moment. "And Lady Vivian," she said, because it needed to be said. The obvious thing that was sitting in the room with them like a third person. The political reality that was not going to dissolve simply because a Falcon had made an inconvenient choice. Something crossed his face at the name. Controlled, but present. "Lady Vivian is a separate matter," he said, and then seemed to recognize that this was insufficient and not quite true. He said, "I will not pretend to you that the situation is simple. It is not. There is a treaty attached to that arrangement that involves the lives of many people. I cannot simply set it aside because a bird has complicated the optics." She said, "I understand." She did understand. She understood it with the particular clarity of someone who had always known their own position in the hierarchy and had built their life accordingly. "But I want to understand what Soren knows about you," Kaelin said, and his voice had shifted in a way she noticed but could not name. "Because I have trusted that bird with my life for 11 years, and he has never steered me wrong. And whatever he saw in you today, he saw it clearly enough to act in front of everyone." She went back to her room that night and sat on the edge of her small bed in the dark and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and tried to think. She was not very good at not thinking, which was its own kind of curse, the inability to simply wait for clarity without the mind churning at the problem like a river against a difficult stone. She thought about her father. She thought about the marks on his work chest, the ones she had traced with her finger as a small child and never thought to wonder about. The ones she had assumed were the same kind of decorative habit a craftsman develops over years of quiet work. She thought about the scroll Soren had brought him, which meant that Soren had been watching her father long before today, had assessed him the way falcons assess, had found something in him worth bringing a message to. She thought about the leather piece on the king's table, the words that 3 scholars had translated into something that sounded less like a historical document and more like a promise or a warning or both. The blood remembers what the name forgot. Her full name, her real name, the one her father had given her that she had shortened in service because it drew unwanted attention, was Mara Edric Vilas. She had always thought Vilas was her mother's family name. Her mother who had died when she was 4 and left no living relatives and no stories behind her except a few phrases her father repeated when he was tired or sad or both. Her mother, her father had said, had come from very far away. Her mother had carried something old in her blood that she would not speak of. Her mother had been, in his words, the bravest person he had ever known, and she had spent her life making herself small to protect something she was afraid of exposing. She had made herself small. She had spent her life making herself small. Mara sat in the dark and felt something very cold and very still move through her. The feeling of a pattern becoming visible after years of looking at its components without understanding. The shape they made together. She was at the mews before dawn the next morning. Soren was awake, which was usual for him, and turned to watch her come in with the alert attention of a creature that had been expecting her. She went to him and let him step onto her arm and held him up so his face was near hers, the warm weight of him solid and real in the cold pre-dawn air. "What do you know?" she said quietly. "What did you see?" He clicked his beak once. She looked into his golden eyes, which were very clear and very deep, and thought, not for the first time, that looking into a falcon's eyes was not like looking into the eyes of most animals. It was more like looking through a window into something very old that was looking back with equivalent curiosity. She had thought this many times and dismissed it as sentimentality. She was less willing to dismiss it this morning. "Soren," she said, and the falcon leaned forward and pressed his forehead, gently, against hers. The contact lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, something moved through Mara that she had no language for. A warmth that was not temperature. A knowing that was not memory exactly, but was adjacent to memory. A sensation of something vast and deep and old, recognizing itself in a new shape. The way a river recognizes the sea when it finally reaches it. Then Soren pulled back and regarded her with his usual dignified expression, and she stood in the mews in the pre-dawn cold and breathed very carefully and tried to determine what had just happened to her. She found Cassian before breakfast. He was in the corridor outside the administrative offices, reviewing documents with the focused efficiency of a man who had been awake for some time, and he looked up when she approached with an expression that shifted through several things before settling on cautious attention. "The name, Velis," she said without preamble, because she had decided on the way from the mews that being direct was going to be more efficient than any other approach. "Do you know it?" He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." She followed him into the office, which smelled of parchment and candle smoke, and he closed the door with the care of a man closing something that needed to be closed. He stood with his back to the door for a moment. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "It is my mother's family name," she said. "It is the name my father gave me. My full name is Mara Vielis." She watched him. He had gone quite still in the way that people go still when something they feared is confirmed. "Your father knew," she said. Not a question. "Your father suspected," Cassian said. "By the time he found the scroll, he suspected. We were not fast enough to protect him from the people who did not want his suspicion confirmed." He moved to the desk and sat heavily, suddenly looking much older than he had moments ago, wearing his age like a coat he had been carrying rather than wearing. "The Velis line," he said carefully, "was the elder branch, before the Veilthorn name, before the kingdom was called Veilthorn, which is itself a corruption of the old word. The founders were 2, not 1. The history's record 1. The other was deliberately removed." She stood very still. "Why?" she said. He looked at her with tired eyes. "Because the elder branch carried the original bond. The first Falcon was theirs. When the line split, Soren went with the younger branch because the elder line chose to step back, to concede, to allow the kingdom to go forward under a single name rather than be torn apart by a succession dispute. They agreed to become invisible." He paused. "They were very good at it." She felt something move across her face. She did not try to stop it. "For generations," she said. "Yes," he said. "Until now." The days that followed were the strangest Mara had ever lived through, which was considerable given that her life had contained a notable quantity of strangeness. She continued her work in the mews, because Soren required care regardless of ancient bloodlines and political upheaval, and because the mews were the only space in the palace where she could breathe without feeling the weight of being observed. The court watched her now in the way courts watch unexpected developments, with a combination of speculation, resentment, and the particular hunger of people who are very bored and have just been given something genuinely interesting to feed on. She was aware of conversations that stopped when she entered rooms. She was aware of certain people going out of their way to demonstrate that they did not find her interesting at all, which was its own kind of interest. She was aware of Vivian. Vivian was very good. Mara had always known this in the abstract way that you know things about people you observe from a distance, but proximity refined the assessment considerably. She never said anything overtly hostile. She never raised her voice or made scenes or gave anyone anything they could point to as direct cruelty. What she did was more precise than that. She asked questions in group settings that reminded people of Mara's father's conviction, questions framed as innocent curiosity. She expressed concern, in that beautifully constructed voice, about the appropriateness of involving a servant girl in matters of historical significance. Surely the scholars were better equipped to investigate such things. She made sure, at every gathering Mara was present for, that the conversation found its way to lineage and legitimacy, and the importance of documented noble blood, to the chaos that resulted when ancient superstitions were allowed to override political practicality, to the fundamental difference between what was romantic and what was real. She was a sculptor of atmosphere. By the end of the first week, Mara could feel the court's initial shock, hardening into something more comfortable for them. A narrative that made Soren's choice an anomaly rather than a signal, a curiosity rather than a revelation. She found the king in the hunting grounds on the fourth morning. He was there alone, which surprised her, without the usual retinue that she had observed from her window on previous occasions, and he was standing at the tree line looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who had come outside specifically to have his face in a place where no one required him to manage it. He heard her. Before she reached him, she knew this because his shoulders changed slightly, a small adjustment that meant he was aware of presence. But he did not turn. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at the tree line alongside him. "She is dismantling it," Mara said. "Piece by piece." The court's willingness to take it seriously. She did not say who she meant. She did not need to. He said without turning. "Yes." She said, "She is very good at it." He said, "She is very good at most things." There was something in his voice that she thought might be sadness, and then revised to something more complicated than sadness. "And you," she said, "what do you want people to think?" He was quiet for a long moment. A bird called somewhere in the trees. "I want to know the truth," he said, "before I decide what I want people to think about it." She appreciated this. She appreciated it enough that she said the next thing she had been debating whether to say. "Cassian told me about the Violis line," she said, "about what my mother's family was." She felt him go very still beside her. "I know," he said. "He told me he told you." She said, "I have not shifted. I have never shifted. If I carry the original bond, if my blood is what that document says it is, then why do I not have what every other shifter in this kingdom has?" He turned then. He was close, the tree line behind him, the morning light between them. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still could not name, that complicated thing he kept very carefully in check. "Because the elder line made themselves invisible," he said. "They suppressed everything, the wolf, the abilities, all of it, deliberately, for generations, until suppression became instinct, and instinct became nature, and no one in your family remembered what was under it anymore." He paused. Except Soren remembered. She went back to her room and sat at the small desk and took out a piece of paper and wrote the signs from her father's work. Chest from memory, all of them, placed in the order she had grown up seeing them. And then she sat and looked at what she had written and breathed. The blood remembers what the name forgot. The line does not end. It waits. She thought about her father, who had spent a year of his life quietly trying to understand something he had received through a Falcon and had never had the chance to tell her. She thought about her mother, who had carried something old in her blood and had made herself small, to protect it, and had taught that smallness to the daughter she would not live to see grow up. She thought about herself. 23 years of making herself invisible. 23 years of being the girl with no wolf and no power and no future. 23 years of pressing herself against pillars and completing work before anyone arrived. And she thought, what if the invisibility was the inheritance? What if making herself unseen was not weakness, but was the last and longest expression of something her family had chosen, deliberately, in an act of love for a kingdom they did not want to see torn apart? And what if, now that Soren had made the choice he had made, in the most public possible way, with the most public possible witness, that particular act of love had served its purpose, and it was time for something else? She did not know how to shift. She did not know how to access whatever was underneath the layers of deliberate suppression her bloodline had laid down across. Generations like sediment over something sleeping. She did not know if it was possible to undo what had been done, or if the sleeping thing was too deep now, too covered, too long unused to respond to anything. What she did know was that the solstice ceremony was in 12 days, the ceremony at which Kaelin was expected to formalize his claim of Vivian, the ceremony that would settle the alliance and make the queen's position official and put the question of a servant girl with a complicated bloodline firmly in the category of interesting footnote rather than relevant development. 12 days. She did not know what she was going to do with 12 days, but she knew she was going to do something, because the alternative was to continue being invisible, and she was not sure she had the ability to do that anymore. Soren had made that particular choice unavailable. She was beginning to think that was exactly what he had intended. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Cassian found her the next morning, and told her that the king had arranged for her to meet with the eldest scholar in the royal archive, a woman named Diva, who had spent 60 years studying the founding period, and who knew things about the original bloodlines that were not in any public record. She went to the archive, which was in the deepest and oldest part of the palace, where the stone was a different color from the later additions, and the air had a quality of preserved stillness, and found Diva exactly where Cassian had said she would be, at a large table covered in documents, a small, fierce woman of at least 80 with sharp, dark eyes, and the bearing of someone who had decided long ago that she was not going to let anyone waste her time. She looked at Mara when she came in and said, without preamble, "You have your mother's eyes. I knew your mother. Long ago, before she made the choices she made. Sit down. We have a great deal to discuss. And I am not as young as I used to be." Mara sat. Diva spoke for 2 hours. She spoke about the founding, about the 2 brothers who had built this kingdom together and the split that had nearly destroyed it, about the elder line's choice to step back and what that choice had cost them and what it had preserved. She spoke about the nature of the original bond, which was not like the bonds most shifters carried, not the instinctive animal connection of wolf to wolf or hawk to handler, but something older and more fundamental, a bond with the land itself, with the power that ran through the kingdom's foundation like water through stone, a bond that the elder line had carried in their blood and had suppressed when they stepped back, and had now, apparently, remembered. She spoke about what it would take for that memory to become active rather than dormant, which was not, as Mara had assumed, some dramatic ritual or external catalyst, but was something simpler and harder than that. Belief, Diva said. Not faith in a religious sense, not hope, which was passive, active belief. The decision to accept what you carried and stop apologizing for the space it required. The decision to be the thing rather than hide from it. She looked at Mara with her sharp, dark eyes and said, "Your mother was the bravest person I have ever known. She chose invisibility out of love, not fear, which is a distinction that matters. But love's usefulness has limits, and you are not your mother." She paused. "Soren knows what you are. The question is whether you do." The nights after that conversation were difficult in the way that nights are difficult, when something has shifted in the understanding, and the body has not yet caught up to it. She slept badly. She dreamed in images she did not have context for, vast dark spaces, and a warmth at the center of them. Something turning slowly like a light source that had always been there, and had simply not been faced. She woke in the small hours of the third night, to find that her hands were warm. Not body warm, but luminously warm. A warmth that emanated rather than absorbed, that lit the immediate air around her fingers with a faint and sourceless golden light. She looked at her own hands for a long time in the dark. She thought about Diva's words. She thought about her father and her mother, and 12 generations of people who had chosen to be smaller than they were. She pressed her palms together and felt the warmth between them and thought, enough. Not dramatically. Not as a declaration. Simply as the recognition of a limit reached and a different direction beginning. Enough of this. Enough of that particular kind of small. She went to the king the next morning. Not summoned. Not arranged through Cassian. She went herself, before the day had properly organized itself into its official structure, while the palace was still in the in-between state of mourning when corridors were transitional spaces, and not yet formal ones. The guard at his study door looked at her with the particular blankness of guards who have received instructions about a specific person and are following them without comment. He opened the door. She went in. Kalen was already at his desk with documents, already organized and proceeding with the day in the way of someone who slept less than was probably advisable and compensated with early starts. He looked up when she entered. "I need to tell you something," she said. "And I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." He put down the document. She sat in the chair across from him without being invited, which was new, and something moved in his expression at that. Something that had the texture of interest, and something else she did not examine closely. She told him about the warmth in her hands the previous night. She told him about Diva and the original bond, and what it meant to be the carrier of something that had been sleeping for 12 generations. She told him about her mother's name, and what it implied about lineage. She told him about the marks on her father's work chest, and what she now believed they said and why they mattered. She told him all of it in the clear, organized way she had marshaled her thoughts walking through the corridor, because she had decided that if she was going to stop apologizing for the space she required, then this conversation was the place to begin. He listened. He did not interrupt. He had the quality of attention. She had come to recognize in him over the past week the capacity for complete stillness when something was genuinely engaging his full concentration, the kind of attention that was rare in powerful people because powerful people were rarely required to simply listen. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me your hands." She held them out across the desk. She thought about the warmth. Not performed, not forced, simply remembered, and it came as if it had been waiting. For her to stop clenching against it, which she understood was probably exactly what had been happening. The warmth moved from the center of her palms outward, a faint golden luminescence, visible but not blinding, warm but not burning, the light of something that had existed for a very long time and was only now being permitted to be seen. He looked at her hands. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before, something that broke through the controlled evenness to reveal a quality underneath it that was entirely unguarded for a few seconds before he caught himself. She dropped her hands back to her lap. He said very quietly, "Velis." She said, "Yes." He said, "The elder branch." She said, "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment with that unguarded expression still present at the edges of his control. "The treaty with Selene," he said. She said, "I know." He said, "There are people whose lives depend on that alliance." She said, "I know that too. Not asking you to choose." She paused. "I am not asking you for anything except that you know the truth. What you do with it is your determination, not mine." He said, "And if the truth requires something from me that I cannot give?" She looked at him steadily. "Then you will have to carry that," she said. "As will I." She did not see him alone again before the solstice ceremony. She saw him in group settings, at the formal proceedings that continued regardless of philosophical upheaval, at the meals she was now included in as a concession to the situation's complexity, and each time he was what he had always been in public, controlled and present, and managing his face with the skill of a man who had been doing it since childhood. But she was aware of him in a way she had not been before the conversation in the study, aware of the specific quality of his attention when it turned in her direction. The particular still quality that meant he was giving something his full concentration. She did not allow herself to think about this too carefully. She had enough to manage without adding that particular complication to the list. Vivienne found her 3 days before the solstice. She came to the Mews again, which Mara thought was deliberate, the choice of a location that emphasized what Mara was, and she stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression that was more direct than any she had worn in company. The construction was still there, the beautiful architecture of her presentation, but beneath it there was something rawer, something that was not rage exactly, but was adjacent to it, in the way that very controlled people's anger is always adjacent, rather than direct. "He is not going to cancel the ceremony," Vivienne said. "I want you to understand that. Whatever he has said to you privately, whatever intimacy you have managed to construct out of this situation, the ceremony will proceed. The alliance is too important." Mara was with Sorin, smoothing his feathers, and she kept her hands moving at their task because stopping would have been a concession. "I know," she said. Vivienne paused. She seemed to have expected more, or different, or resistance. "You know," she said, "and you accept it." Mara looked at her. "Accepting facts is not the same as being content with them," she said. "I am not going to fight you for something that is not mine to fight for. He is going to make the choice that he determines is right. That is his determination." Vivienne studied her for a long moment. "You love him," she said. And this time, the construction slipped entirely for a moment, exposing something very human underneath. Something that was not triumph or strategy, but was a kind of pain. She looked for just that moment, like someone who understood loss in a personal sense. "I think you may," she said, quieter. Then she rebuilt herself, precise and complete, and turned to go. She stopped in the doorway. "Whatever you carry in your blood," she said without turning back, "I hope it is worth it. I hope it is worth what it has cost you to find it." She left. Mara kept her hands on Sorin's feathers and breathed, and felt the warmth move in her palms, and thought that understanding your enemies was never as comforting as it should be. The night before the solstice, she could not sleep. She went to the Mews at midnight, which she had never done before, and Sorin was awake as if he had expected her, which perhaps he had. She sat cross-legged on the clean hay of the Mews floor and let him step from his perch to her knee, where he settled with the comfortable authority of a creature at home. The moon through the Mews window was cold and full, and very bright. She thought about her father in the archive with a scroll he did not understand, and her mother with something old in her blood that she had chosen to protect by hiding it, and herself, with warm hands and 12 days of trying to understand what she was supposed to do with the thing. She thought about what Diva had said. Not faith, belief, active, the decision to accept what you carry. She pressed her warm hands gently against Sorin's sides, feeling the living warmth of him against the warmth of her, and she thought with the clarity that comes very late at night, when there is nothing left to pretend about. I am not afraid of what I am. I do not know what it means yet. I do not know what it will cost or what will happen, or whether any of this resolves in the way that things are supposed to resolve. But I am not afraid. She felt something settle in her, deep, like the last piece of a mechanism sliding into place. The warmth in her hands intensified briefly, golden in the dark of the Mews, and Sorin made a sound she had never heard him make before, low and resonant, less a bird sound than something older than birds. And the moon came through the window and lit everything in pale silver, and she sat with the sacred falcon of Valthorn, and breathed and felt, for the first time, entirely and completely like herself. The solstice ceremony was held in the great hall, the largest space in the palace, with every window dressed and every surface lit with the particular golden light of the season's formal occasions. The court assembled in full, which meant everyone, every lord and lady and dignitary and scholar and advisor and official, standing in the concentric rings of precedence that the ceremony required, watching the elevated platform at the hall's center where the formal claiming would occur. Mara stood in the back. She had been directed to a position that was technically inside the hall, but at its margins, which was more consideration than she had expected, and less than the situation probably warranted, and she had accepted it because she was not here to make a statement. She was here because she could not be anywhere else, and because the alternative was a room alone with her thoughts, and she had done enough of that. Vivian was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. She stood on the platform in the silver and white of the solstice formal dress, every element of her presentation calibrated to the moment with the precision of a masterwork. And she was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are exactly what they were designed to be. Kaelin stood across from her on the platform. He was wearing the formal black and gold of Valethorn's most official occasions, and he looked like a king in the way that kings look when they have earned the title rather than inherited the expectation, with a gravity that was not performance, but reality. He had not looked at Mara when he entered the hall. She had not expected him to. She had told him this was his determination, and she had meant it. Lord Cassian began the formal words of the ceremony. She had never witnessed this ritual before, and she listened with the part of her attention that was not occupied with controlling her breathing, which she was finding more difficult than usual. The words were old and formal, and had a cadence that made them feel like they existed slightly outside the present moment, like listening to something that had been said in the same way many times before, and would be said many more times in the future, the ritual expressing its own continuity. She watched the platform. She watched Kaelin's face. He was controlled. He was perfectly, entirely controlled. She could see nothing in his expression that indicated anything except the serious attention of a man performing an important ceremony. She thought about Diva saying that his family had been making themselves small for generations. She thought about how she had confused her own smallness for safety. She thought, we are not so different, he and I. We have both been hiding. And then Soren arrived. No one had brought him. He had not been part of the ceremony. He was in the mews at the far end of the east wing, which was a substantial distance from the great hall, and there was no mechanism by which a falcon locked in a mews could enter a sealed ceremony hall in the middle of the night, except through the particular brand of intention that Mara had stopped dismissing as impossible several days ago. He came through the high window at the eastern end of the hall, which should not have been open, and which someone, perhaps, had opened precisely for this possibility. He flew the length of the great hall, with the focused intentionality of something that knew where it was going. Lord Cassian stopped speaking mid-word. The court froze. Kaelin's controlled expression cracked for the first time, not into any single readable emotion, but into something raw and present and completely unguarded. Soren flew past him. He flew past Vivian. He flew the entire length of the hall to its far margin, to the back, where Mara stood in the crowd's edge with her heart very loud in her chest, and he landed on her shoulder with the same comfortable authority with which he had always landed on her shoulder, as if this had been the destination all along, as if everything else had been the approach. She stood very still. 300 people were looking at her. This was a different experience than 12 days ago, because 12 days ago she had been surprised, and now she was not. Now she understood what it meant. She understood what the bird was saying, in the wordless language of ancient creatures who had been appointed to a particular kind of witnessing. He was saying, this one, again, still, in front of all of you, this one. She reached up and let Soren step from her shoulder to her raised hand, and she held him up so that his ember feathers caught the ceremony lights, and everyone in the hall could see him clearly. The sacred falcon with his golden eyes and his ancient bloodline, looking at her with the same complete certainty with which he had looked at her on the first morning of her life, before the first life ended and the second one began. And she looked back at him with the same certainty, newly arrived, but entirely real. She was not afraid. The court erupted. Not into chaos exactly, but into the particular organized tumult of 300 people processing something simultaneously and having different, strongly held opinions about it. Cassian was saying something from the platform. Vivienne was very still, and her stillness was more eloquent than anything she could have said. Kaylin was looking at Mara across the length of the hall with an expression she had never seen on a human face before, not in 3 years of careful observation, something that was past controlling, something that had the quality of decision, the quality of a thing finally chosen after a very long time of not choosing. He stepped down from the platform. He crossed the hall. The crowd parted with the automatic deference of bodies responding to power before the mind has processed the instruction, and he came through the parted crowd with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made up his mind and was no longer interested in managing how that looked. He stopped in front of her. Soren was on her raised hand between them, and the Falcon looked at the king with what appeared to be profound satisfaction. Mara looked at Kaylin. He looked at her. "The treaty," she said, because it still needed to be said, because facts did not evaporate because of feelings. "Can be renegotiated," he said. "Solène wants peace. There are other paths to peace than the one we planned. Cassian has been exploring them." She said, "You already asked him to." He said, "I asked him to look 2 days ago, before I knew what tonight would be." She said, "That is not very long to explore." He said, "No, but he's very good at his work, and the beginning of a solution is visible, and I am done waiting for certainty before I am willing to move." He paused. His eyes stayed on her face, entirely open now, everything held back, finally released into an expression that was both enormous and simple. "Soren chose you," he said. 12 days ago, he chose you, and every day since he has chosen you. And tonight, he chose you again in front of everyone, and I have spent 12 days being a practical man, and I am very tired of it. She felt the warmth in her hands. She felt the thing in her blood that was 12 generations old and had been waiting. She felt herself, fully and without apology, the whole size of what she was, without any part of it. Compressed. "I do not know how to be a queen," she said. "I barely know how to be a person who takes up appropriate space." He said, "Neither did I at the beginning." He reached out and touched her face, briefly, carefully, with the awareness of the room around them, and also with a completeness of intention that made the room feel irrelevant. "Start with this," he said. "Start with knowing that whatever is in you that Soren can see, I can see it too. And it is not small. It has never been small." She closed her eyes for one moment and felt the warmth move through her completely, from hands to chest, to the center of the thing she was. Felt it declare itself without reservation. Felt the long sleeping weight of her blood finally, fully, unambiguously wake. When she opened her eyes, the golden light was visible, not just in her hands but present around her, a warmth that had nowhere to hide because she was no longer hiding it. The court was very still and very silent. Soren made the sound he had made in the mews at midnight, that resonant old sound that was older than birds. She looked at the 300 people who were looking at her and thought of her father with his scroll, and her mother with her name, and 12 generations of deliberate invisibility. And she thought, "I see you, all of you, and you see me, and this is the end of hiding." She looked at Kaylin. He was looking back at her with his whole face, nothing managed, nothing held in check. "I will need to learn a great deal," she said. "Very quickly." He said, "I know." She said, "And there will be people who do not accept this, who will not accept me." He said, "I know that too." She said, "And you are prepared for that." He said, "I have been preparing for it since a falcon looked at you across a ceremony ground. And I looked at you and understood that I had been ignoring something right in front of me for 3 years, because it was inconvenient to notice it." She felt something in her chest that was not the warmth, that was simply and entirely human, that was simply herself, responding to a person in the oldest and most uncomplicated way. She said, "Then we begin here." He said, "Yes." Soren clicked his beak, once, with the satisfaction of a task completed to his exact specifications, and the ceremony lights caught his ember feathers and set them briefly, brilliantly aflame, and the hall filled with the sound of 300 people understanding that they had just witnessed something they would spend the rest of their lives describing to other people. Vivienne left the platform quietly. Mara watched her go with the particular complexity of someone watching a person they had understood well enough to feel something genuine for, despite everything. Vivienne turned once at the hall's side door and looked back, and their eyes met across the crowded space. It was not a warm look. It was not entirely cold either. It was the look of someone who was going to handle their loss with the same precision with which they handled everything else, and who found, in the midst of that, some small, reluctant thing that was almost like recognition. Then she was gone, and the hall was full of people, and light, and the sound of a world reorganizing itself around a new understanding. Cassian appeared at Kaylin's shoulder with the timing of a man who had been waiting for the right moment, and had determined that this was it. "The Selene delegation is in the blue receiving room," he said, calmly. "And I have a framework for the new terms that I believe will hold. If you would like to begin that conversation this evening, while the moment is still fluid, I believe it would be advantageous." Kaylin looked at him. "You prepared this framework 2 days ago when I asked you to look." Cassian said, "I prepared it 4 days ago when I determined which direction things were moving and thought it prudent to have something ready." There was a very brief silence. "Of course you did," Kaylin said, and something in his expression shifted to something that, in another man, would have been called affection, and that in Kaylin was visible for exactly 2 seconds before the professional register returned. He looked at Mara. She said, "Go. This matters and it needs to be handled." He said, "Come with me." She said, "I am a servant in the East Wing Mews." He said, "Not tonight." She looked at him. She thought about all the times she had made herself small to move through rooms without being noticed, and about the warmth in her hands, and about Soren on her raised arm declaring something to an audience of the whole court. She thought about the leather scroll with its ancient words. The blood remembers what the name forgot. She thought, "I remember." She said, "All right," and she went. The months that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be simple, and she would have been suspicious if they were, because nothing worth building is built without difficulty, and she had always had a pragmatic relationship with difficulty, having had extensive practice with it. The treaty negotiation with Selene proceeded through Cassian's capable hands and reached a conclusion that was, by most assessments, better than the original arrangement in several respects, which was the particular kind of outcome that makes an advisor legend in his own time. Vivienne returned to the Selene territories, and there were dispatches later describing her new role in her family's administration, sharp and capable, and precisely the right person for what was needed there, which Mara read with the complicated feeling of someone who understood another person well enough to wish them something like peace, even at a distance. The court took time. Some of it took longer than time. Lord Fenwick never entirely reconciled himself to the situation, and said so, in the careful way of men who understand that saying it outright is impolitic, in 100 small registered objections that Mara learned to read and navigate, and occasionally, when the occasion called for it, simply refused to manage. She was done managing herself for the comfort of other people. That particular era was closed. Diva taught her. Through the winter and into the following spring, the old scholar worked with her in the archive, the oldest and deepest part of the palace, going through the records of the founding period with the methodical care of someone laying out the pieces of a mechanism so it could be understood. Mara learned the names and the history and the weight of what she carried. Learned it not as abstraction but as reality. Her reality. The thing that had been in her blood while she cleaned Falcon Mews and pressed herself against pillars and made herself smaller than she was. She learned what the original bond meant in practical terms, which was different from the ceremonial terms, and she learned how to use it. Not the warmth of her hands exactly, though that remained and grew more precise over time, but the deeper thing underneath it, the connection to the kingdom's foundation that expressed itself in ways she had not had language for, and now did. She learned slowly. She was 23, and had years of suppression to work against, and she had no patience for people who implied this should be otherwise. Soren stayed on her shoulder. Not literally always, because he was a working falcon with a working hawk's dignity and preferences, but in the sense that matters. He remained. He did not change his choice. In every formal occasion and every public ceremony, and every gathering where the question of whether yesterday's extraordinary event was really what it appeared to be might arise, Soren made the same declaration he had made in the beginning, without drama, without alteration, with the complete certainty of a creature who had made his assessment and found nothing in subsequent evidence to revise it. The formal ceremony happened in early summer, when the hunting grounds were green, and the court had had enough time to shift from shock to the particular resigned acceptance that tends to follow events too well witnessed to be credibly denied. It was not a large ceremony. It was precise and old, and used the original words from the founding period that Diva had translated, words that acknowledged both lines and both inheritances, and the decision they were making together, rather than the decision being made for them. Kaelin took her hand, her warm hand, in front of the assembled court, and spoke the words that made her position official in the oldest and most fundamental way the kingdom knew how to formalize. And Soren landed on the clasped hands between them, and spread his ember wings once, wide, in the manner of the old ceremony texts, and the court, most of it, some of it still reluctant, witnessed a thing that had not been witnessed in so long that most of them had believed it was only story. She looked out at them, the court of Velthorn, the lords and ladies and advisors and officials and scholars who had watched her press herself against pillars for 3 years and seen nothing worth noting, and she held the king's hand and felt the warmth of her own blood and the warmth of his and the warmth of the falcon between them. And she thought of her father and her mother and 12 generations of people who had been braver than she had been allowed to know until now, who had chosen the kingdom over themselves in the most complete and generous way available to them, and who had made it possible for this moment to exist, even though they had not lived to see it. She thought, I see you. All of you. You are not forgotten. I remember. And then she looked at Kaelin, who was looking at her with the completely open expression she had learned was available in him when he trusted the moment enough to let it be seen. And she thought, This is what beginning looks like. Not perfect, and not simple, and full of things to navigate and things to build, and difficulties to face with pragmatism and patience, and the particular quality of courage that is not dramatic, but is simply the decision to stay, to remain, to not compress yourself to the size of someone else's comfort when you know what you actually are. She thought, I know what I am. She thought, I am not afraid of it. She thought, finally, if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? Soren lifted from their joined hands and rose in a single sweep toward the high windows of the ceremony hall, his ember feathers catching the summer light and setting it briefly, extravagantly on fire. And the court watched him go with upturned faces, all of them, even the reluctant ones, even the ones who were still working through their objections, because there are some things that are simply too beautiful and too certain to look away from. The falcon rose until he was a small, bright shape against the light, and then came back, precisely and completely, to her shoulder, as he had always meant to, as he had always known, as she knew now too, without fear and without apology, with the warmth of 12 generations finally, completely, irrevocably awake.